Hello, friends. Welcome back to Our World in Focus. It's been a while, as you can probably tell. There's been lots of things changing. So, I'm currently in South Africa. It would be nice to maybe even do a history of South Africa episode. So, if there's interest in that, let me know. And Judah, my podcast co host, isn't with me. So, he's moved back to the UK, settled in. And we didn't figure out the technology. So, I decided to do an episode by myself, and it's a history episode about India. And interestingly, the Kenya history episode was Judah's most boring to record with me because I did 80% of the talking, but it was actually the most popular episode from season one. So I'm bringing that back, and I think Judah will be secretly glad that he's not with me. And I wanted to take you through a very brief history of India, but of course to add my own perception and reflections because it was a big trip for me because I was going to India for the first time properly as an adult. I went very briefly when I was 1 years old, so I have no memory. So to me, it's effectively like the first time. And I went to regions that my family are from. So my father's family are Bengali from a village near Calcutta, and my mother's side are Punjabi from a village near Jalandhar. So it was really impactful for me to delve into my personal cultural history and ethnic background, but also to learn more about India because I realized I had so many misconceptions about India, even though I was Indian origin. And I know that there's millions of Indian diaspora people that have never been to India. I've met lots of them in South Africa when I was even in East Africa as well. And there'll be lots in North America and even in the UK, Australia, like a lot of these places where Indians went with the British. So perhaps my reflections and information can be interesting to people. And for people that aren't Indian background, it's a country that attracts a lot of attention. It's the most populous country in the world at the moment. I think there's about 1.5 billion people almost. And then you add on the diaspora people of a few extra million. There's a lot of Indians out there. And I mean, curry is like the national dish of so many countries, including the UK and here in South Africa also. So, yeah, hopefully this will be of interest. And when I was learning about India, I realized that I didn't really understand how vast India actually is. I now think of India a bit like a continent. Perhaps that's why they call it the subcontinent, because each of the states is so diverse and has its own history, which I couldn't do justice in a short podcast episode. But it felt like when I was traveling with Judah for 4 months through India, it felt like I was in different countries, from kind of Maharashtra and Mumbai to Hyderabad to Bengal to Punjab to Sikkim. Like Sikkim was a whole another world where everyone looked like they were from China, and there was lots of Tibetan culture, and yeah, India is just such a diverse place. So I'd encourage you to visit, to delve into it, and understand the individual states. But I want to take a more bird's eye view and discuss that. But of course, it will be a biased history in the sense that I'll focus on things that I'm interested in and maybe add some of my opinions. But yeah, there's a very interesting podcast called Empire Podcast with Anita Anand and William Dalrymple, and that's really good at looking at the British Empire in India in a very nuanced, balanced perspective. But that guy William Dalrymple, he's a English background person that's lived in India, so he understands both worlds, and he's a very good historian. He wrote a very interesting book called The Golden Road, which was released last year, and that taught me a lot about ancient India. And ancient India was very influential with spreading its ideas and influencing the ancient world, hence this new term, the Golden Road, because people have talked about the Silk Road bringing trade from China, but actually there's an argument that the Indian trade and language and culture and religions was as or if not more influential than the other great Asian power in China. And the history of India, goes back millennium, before most modern countries were even like a dot on the map. Um, the other interesting thing that's maybe obvious to people but wasn't obvious to me is that like what we conceive of India now didn't exist. Kind of, I find it ironic, but what we see as modern India wasn't fully unified until after the British left. But there was lots of different empires that controlled large parts of India, but no one controlled what we now see as India. However, even in ancient times, it was still seen as a relatively kind of homogeneous geographical area, everything south of the Himalayas. But that's the first thing to kind of say to you, which I think, for some of us younger people that have just grown up in the modern world, we don't always realize that these countries, these lines on the map weren't always the case. And, some of them are quite recent. So that's just something that I find interesting. That's probably basic to people. But yeah, ancient India, one of the early civilizations was called the Indus Valley Civilization. And it was actually like one of the world's earliest large urban civilizations. You'll have probably heard of Egypt and Mesopotamia. And they had the ruins and archaeological discoveries have shown there was lots of advanced town planning. They had drainage systems. They had standardized weights. And for that time period was quite remarkable in its sophistication as well. And then people started to come from North India, and that's when some of the ancient Hindu documents and scriptures, the Vedas, were composed, and the caste system started to form. I mean, I could probably do a whole podcast episode just on the caste system and social dynamics within India, but it's rooted to probably like 1,000+ years before Christ. So it's very embedded in kind of Indian culture. And that's when the Sanskrit language started to take root. And the few hundred years before Christ is when some of these historical religions started to actually rise. And that's a interesting thing about kind of ancient India before the medieval era, is that if you look at Asia now, the majority religion is Buddhism. Whether you go to, I know China is kind of like state atheism type thing, but still Buddhism was very big in China and in Southeast Asia, and in East Asia Buddhism's very big. And Buddhism, it started in India. So the founder of Buddhism, Siddhartha Gautama, was actually born in what is now modern Nepal. But it was in the state of what is now Bihar that he had his enlightenment, that there's still some really cool Buddhist history there as well. And the fact that Buddhism became a religion of a lot of the Asian countries shows the heavy influence that it had in the ancient world. And even now, the largest Hindu temple is in Cambodia, Angkor Wat, right? And so that's really interesting to see how the spread of religious ideas shows the influence of the kind of ancient Indian culture. Even though Buddhism is a minority in India, it's spread throughout most of Asia, which is quite interesting. And there was even a famous university called Nalanda University, and that was in Bihar, and it was a Buddhist university. And you can still go to the ruins. I didn't manage to go. It was on my list, but I think when I go back, I want to go. And scholars came from all across Asia to study there. You could think of it almost like, India's Harvard or Oxford or Cambridge. And it was very advanced and very kind of strict schedules and things that they would learn, and it was unfortunately destroyed in the late 1100s. But I read an interesting fact that they had so many books, the library, that it continued burning. It didn't fully stop burning for months after. So that just shows like what a kind of center of knowledge that was. And also just before that as well, or BC, there was a Mauryan Empire. So that was Chandragupta Maurya. He started it at kind of about 300 BC, but then Ashoka the Great, he was also part of the empire, and he was the one who actually spread Buddhism across Asia. After he took part in a war, he famously converted to Buddhism, and even now there's lots of his monuments and stuff. So he was one of the kind of old emperors of one of the bigger kind of ancient empires. And then after that, there was a Gupta Empire, which went from probably 300 to 500 AD, and that's where a lot of the kind of ancient kind of concepts or discoveries that are attributed to India can be traced back to here. So lots of different advances in science, astronomy, literature, even mathematics, the zero, the decimal system. Even that, the Indian contribution to mathematics is fascinating, because I think the concept of a zero, which again we'll all take for granted, apparently was a massive game changer that then spread throughout the whole world and helped the field of mathematics develop. And this part of Indian history as well is where a lot of the kind of Hindu art, temples, different culture developed. And then there were, like I said, lots of different empires that came and went. But if we move now into medieval India, this is where they started to get some Islamic influence. And it was about 1200 where the Delhi Sultanate came, and there were 5 different dynasties that ruled parts of northern India, and they came from above India, and it was a blend of like Persian, Turkish, Indian culture. So India, even now, it's a complete mishmash, beautiful mix of different cultures and, belief systems and different ideas, and, things that we now call Indian has probably been influenced by so many different cultures, and especially the kind of medieval and modern India when the Delhi Sultanate and then the Mughal Empire, and it was the Delhi Sultanate that started to introduce some of these new like architectural styles, Sufi Islam, and what is now the Urdu language can be traced back to that as well. And then after that, there was a Mughal Empire that started in the 1500s. And I think this is a part of Indian history that's known a bit more, because they were the last great empire before the British came. So I think that's why people know about them. And of course, some of their architecture and buildings still exist, like the world famous Taj Mahal. That was Shah Jahan, emperor. He built it for his wife. I mean, it is very beautiful. I think it's slightly overrated, and there were loads of fake tour guides which spoiled the experience. But it is very beautiful. And then they kind of put in place this kind of rich Indo-Persian history and culture and architecture, and it was a very sophisticated empire. There was also the Marathi Empire as well, which was in what is now Maharashtra, where Mumbai is the capital. And I don't know so much about that history, but I do know that the current government really like that history. So the current government, the BJP, they're very popular in India. And if I'm trying to be kind of politically correct and stuff, they're right-wing, more orthodox Hindu national party. And so they've been trying to, hide, or not hide, but trying to overlook parts of Indian history. So they're trying to talk a lot more about the Marathi Empire because they were a Hindu empire that fought against the Mughal Empire, and yeah, there's lots of interesting history there as well. So they were kind of in the 1500s to 1900s. So they were also one of the big empires, which is good to know about. And they were, still on the scene when the British were here. And yeah, the Mughal Empire, the last emperor, wasn't really so. He wasn't so effective, and he expanded his empire. I think it was what's the name? Aurangzeb. I find the names a bit hard sometimes, but it's that classic thing of empires rise and fall. This guy tried to expand his empire too much. There was a Marathi empire that was fighting against him. What's that Marathi guy? I think Chatrapatra. I probably messed up that guy's name, but was a really really cool leader of the Marathi Empire. So anyway, so the Mughal Empire was getting weaker, and that's when there was an opportunity for foreign influencers to come. And so the East India Company, they started to get involved after 1600. And there were lots of European players actually that were coming because, like I said, India was so big and a collection of different empires. On the west coast, what is Gujarat now, there was like lots of Portuguese outposts, and everyone that knows India has heard of Goa, which became independent like 15 years after India became independent. That was one of the last Portuguese outposts, but they had outposts there, and like England weren't the first European power, first to the party. The Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, they were all kind of exploring Asia before the English, and even the French started to expand, and all the European powers wanted to kind of get in on the act because they had used a lot of this technological advancements, and they were in a part of the history where they wanted to explore, and because India was so vast, there were opportunities for trade like any country. So the French had outposts as well on the other side, on the east coast. So there's a city down south called Pondicherry, and apparently it has lots of French influence as well. And there was even, it's interesting because near where my grandparents' village is in West Bengal, up the Hooghly River, there are lots of historical kind of towns where these European places were. So in Chandanagar is an old French town, and then Serampore is an old Danish town, and then Calcutta, of course, was an old British administrative capital. So it's very interesting, especially West Bengal, because by the time the British, firmly settled down in East India, they were West Bengal and that region, West Bengal, what is now West Bengal, Orissa and Bihar, was probably one of the richest places on earth because of the textile industry. And in fact, when they've done economic calculations, India's share of the global GDP was around 25% at this point when the British kind of cemented, and afterwards, when all was said and done, they were down to 3%. So that just shows you how much colonialism actually helped India economically. But so it just started off as trading all these different European powers, and gradually as England became slightly stronger, then they were able to venture out. And in fact, at that time, everyone was going to like what is now Indonesia, where the Dutch were going. So that was the East Indies, and that's where England were trying to join the party. The East India Company isn't referring to east of what is now India, it's the East Indies. So they were trying to get in on the party, and kind of like they were fortunate to discover the trade and stuff happening in India, because they weren't strong enough to target the Dutch and Portuguese directly initially. And what was interesting is that there was a story where this guy called Robert Clive, who's one of the famous figures in early colonial Indian history, he asked the British Crown to have some troops to go to India because they had a memo that the French were going to set up an outpost in India. So he had the British Crown send some troops. In the end, it was wrong. The French troops were going to Quebec up in Canada, but they had lots of troops. And at that time, in Bengal, there were these people called the Nawabs, which were kind of governors. So there was a particularly corrupt Nawab of Bengal, and some of the rich bankers didn't like how he was kind of treating them and affecting their profits. So they kind of bribed this guy, Robert Clive, and was like, we'll give you some money. Can you defeat this guy? Because I think we can work with you people. And that's where the British kind of foothold started to come in. But if I rewind slightly, the East India Company, it was started in 1600. And what's interesting that the Empire podcast kind of taught me or reminded me was that the East India Company, it was a kind of like multinational corporation, kind of like the Amazons or the Apples of today. Like, how Amazon's very powerful. It can start a factory in a country, not pay tax, then move on and influence people. So it actually wasn't owned by the British Crown. Like it was a private company, right? So it was at its height, it actually had an army double the size of the British Crown, so the official British government. So it was separate. So that's quite interesting how it was this private entity. And when the concept of stocks were invented, then they started investing into the East India Company, and then it gradually grew, and they made their money, especially when they went to India. And Robert Clive defeated this Nawab of Bengal, and that was in the Battle of Plassey. So this is 1757. So between 1600 to 1757, there's trade happening, everyone's benefiting, there's different Indian empires. And then apparently he was quite fortuitous as well, because they were fighting this army and they were losing, but apparently monsoon came, or it was monsoon season, and started raining, and the enemy troops forgot to cover their gunpowder, but Robert Clive's troops covered their gunpowder, so their gunpowder stayed dry, then they could win the battle. So it's really interesting to see how there's loads of these things in history which I find interesting, how certain massive events that shaped the world had seemingly very innocuous and basic things. So that's quite interesting. But this guy became one of the richest men in the world because, like I said, West Bengal, that region was very rich. So these bankers then paid him because they didn't like this other governor. And then Robert Clive became very rich. And then he used this money to then, buy more mercenaries, train up like local Indian troops. And he took a lot of power. You have to listen to some of the episodes about him in Empire Podcast. It sounds like quite a troubled character. In the end, I think he took his own life, and I guess it just shows how having all the wealth and fame doesn't necessarily help. But the battle after that, the kind of significant one, was in 1764, the Battle of Buxar. So that's when Robert Clive and the East India Company, that's when they got the revenue rights, called the rights of the Diwani, for Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, which, like I said, was one of the richest places in the world. So it was in 1764 that the East India Company settled down in that east section of India and became this private empire with its own army, currency, judiciary. And then they started to make deals with a lot of the other empires. And like I said, no one unified what is now modern India, including the British. So they owned the kind of British-owned India was about 60% of what we'd call modern India, but the other 40% was all still in different empires and rulers and Maharajas and princes, and there was some, that were big, like multi-city empires, and there was some Maharajas that were just the equivalent of one city, right? Because there were this complete amalgamation of all these different rulers and stuff. So the East India Company started becoming very rich with this rich part of India. Then they had more money, then they could do more deals, and they did lots of kind of underhand tactics and deals, and either use mercenary might or kind of did different trade deals, and then gradually cemented themselves. And then with the wealth that they made from this, and they could get a bigger army, and so they slowly grew, but they didn't manage India well because it was a private corporation, right? If you think of like some of these other big ones now, do they want the best for the individuals and the countries? Probably not. They're trying to focus on their shareholders. So the East India Company was the same, where they didn't manage a lot of the industries that well. There was like deindustrialization, especially in Bengal textiles. There were lots of different famines because of their cash crop policies, whether that's indigo, opium, tea, and it's still a part of history that I'm learning lots about, that I want to learn more about. But even apparently in 1876 to 78, there were almost 10 million people that died because of famine with some of these policies that were under the British. But that's going ahead of myself slightly because I'm trying to be clear on terminology. It was the East India Company up until 1858. Okay, but the East India Company weren't managing India well, and their troops weren't very happy, and people were unhappy, right? Because they could tell that it wasn't for their own benefit. They weren't given any opportunity, the native Indian people. It was all given to East India Company people, and the kind of people that would come to India. Apparently they had this thing, East India Company, where you couldn't come if you were older than 19. So lots of 16 to 19-year-olds came, and the vast majority of them died with disease or health problems. And the ones that survived had a chance of making a fortune, but lots of them were just looking for a better life, kind of like not the very, very wealthy from England, but they were just traveling. And you have to remember, at that time, in the 1700s, England wasn't rich. It wasn't this big empire. That came, like in 1900s. So people were just being opportunistic and looking out for themselves, not for the local population. So people were unhappy. And that takes us to the 1857 uprising. So I hope you're with me. I know this is quite a whistle-stop tour. I'm just trying to review everything that I learned also. So it's a good review for me also. So I'll take a brief pause, give you a breather. And the 1857, it's called India Mutiny, according to British sources, but Indian sources call it the First War of Independence. So the story goes that troops were unhappy with the East India Company, and then there was a rumor that there was these new guns with bullets that were greased with animal fat, and the rumors were that they were cow fat, which is offensive to Hindus, and pig fat, which is offensive to the Muslims. And you had to bite the bullet, load it in your gun. The generals at this point, they were warned that these guns wouldn't be popular, but they didn't care because they thought that they had the power. But there was basically a mutiny that spread all across North India, and then there was different killings, and a few of the English people in India were killed. But this is where actually the worst massacres of the British in India happened. So it was very brutally crushed. They basically massacred civilians in Delhi and a lot of these other cities, and it was very, very ruthless. and there was lots of propaganda in England at that time. Kill all these barbaric Indians that dared to kill the native white rulers in India, and some very horrific things, like literally any male, I forgot above what age, whether it was 18 or whatever, but no matter how old you were, they were just slaughtered and blood was running, and it was a very disproportionate show of force. And I could probably again do a full episode on British colonial history, because I try and keep some balanced perspective, and by traveling it's given me lots of nuance, and I have read books that are by like empire apologists, and the British Empire seems to almost have a reputation of being kind of benevolent rulers, which maybe is comparing to some of the other colonial empires, but I think some facts are very undisputed, some of the damage. I'm not trying to make a moral case about this British Empire was the worst one to exist and had no benefits. But yeah, before I go off on that tangent, there may have been some benefits, but there were definitely some very bad, like human losses of life, either through indirect policies like famines, through bad economic management, or through pure brutal force where hundreds of thousands of people were killed, like in this crushing of the First War of Independence. But things were a mess with the East India Company. They mismanaged India purely for profit. So then the Crown assumed direct control, and then Queen Victoria came in to try be the hero and said, okay, 1858, British Raj, we're going to promise equal treatment, but this was rarely practiced. So things were better than the East India Company, perhaps, but that was purely pragmatic, because they knew that to keep everyone happy, they had to lead a bit different. So Indians were then involved in the civil service, but normally in lower roles. It was still very hard to increase. And there was racial segregation, still lots of economic extraction, and still kind of propping up the British Empire. And a lot of the wealth from the Indian Empire, it went into the British Empire. So helping all their exploits and going to other countries and going to Africa. So so they benefited a lot. And there was lots of different mismanagement, but there was a pause in World War One, right? So World War One, there were lots of Indian troops that were actually signed up by the British, and at this stage, it's easy for us to kind of forget now, but Indians didn't necessarily want full independence, right? Because India had never been fully independent under one entity. They kind of wanted to have opportunities at the table to be able to contribute to their country. And, people like Gandhi, who is another very interesting character, and he actually has, history here in South Africa where I am now. But he was a big chief recruiter for the army actually in World War One, where he was saying, if you don't fight for the British, you're not, a true patriotic Indian, or, you're not kind of helping your motherland. And most went to what is now Iraq, but they weren't equipped, and most died. But then the ones that came home expected to be rewarded, because other colonies were kind of promised some more independence. But the Indians weren't given what they thought, and even what they were promised, to have a bit more independence. And it's not full independence, but a bit more say in how their country is ran. And there was a Rowlatt Act, which was very repressive and kind of holding back against Indians. And then came the 1919 infamous Amritsar massacre in the Jallianwala Bagh. So this is 1919. So if you followed with me, the East India Company started in 1600, traded in India. 1757 started having an outpost in East India, West Bengal. Then after 1764 started to spread, mismanage, exploit it. There was Indian Massacre 1858. Then it was very like brutally repressed. Then the British Crown stepped in 1858, right? So they're in charge at this point. But then in 1919, there was a massacre that again no British Empire apologist can kind of hide or scrub over. Was a very horrific thing and somewhere close to home for me as well, because that was in Punjab. So the cultural and economic and religious capital of Punjab is Amritsar. So it was the it was the Sikh holy festival of Vaisakhi, which is about the birth of Sikhism in 1699. So people were gathering, it was a very peaceful protest. And then General Dyer, who was basically a bit of a corrupt, power-hungry British guy, he ordered open fire to unarmed civilians, and around 1,000 people were killed in about 10 minutes. So like I think about 1,500 shots were fired. And I went to this Jallianwala Bagh site, and there's a museum there, and it's very emotional actually. You can see the bullet marks, you can hear about some of the survivors, and you can see the well that lots of people jumped in to escape and also died in there, and you can see the very thin doorways to get out of it. So it was very sad, and there was no remorse from General Dyer. Again, he was celebrated in some of the British propaganda back home, and just basically got a slap on the wrist effectively. And he even said if he could have got the tanks and armored vehicles through the doors, he would have killed even more. And after that, it was very brutal. He in one of the roads, he would force Indians to kind of crawl, because he was trying to kind of show his dominance. And it was also, I think he was reacting because there was an English lady was harassed before that, so he didn't want this English lady to be harassed. It was actually an Indian guy that stopped the harassing and kind of told the people to go away. But General Dyer was just this power hungry kind of corrupt guy. And after this massacre, that's when the British Empire in India was no longer seen as actually a feasible thing that was actually good for India. So that's when a lot of these people started to change their opinion. And so, especially for Gandhi, who's a very big figure in Indian independence, that's when he changed his perspective, because it was hidden in the newspaper for quite a few days. And back then there's no social media or stuff, so it took time to find out. But eventually when they found out, it was very horrific. So Gandhi actually returned in 1915 from South Africa, and then after this Amritsar massacre, he started this non-cooperation movement in 1920, and then the Salt March in 1930, and then Quit India movement in 1942. And there's lots of other key Indian characters as well. I haven't done so much kind of research into all of these other characters. I think Gandhi is the most famous in the Western world because of his non-violent perspective that's quite palatable. But and he was a remarkable guy, slightly strange at times, but yeah, very, very remarkable. And I went to some really cool museums as well and saw the site where he was killed, and the places that he lived in different cities and stuff. But yeah, lots of things happened anyway. And the British actually, they started to differentiate between religion. Okay, so there's lots of these former colonial empires, the former European places, European owned or colonized places where any existing differences were um, exacerbated. So we saw this in East Africa, where the tribal system was used by the British to kind of um, promote certain groups and push down other groups, and even by the Belgians in Rwanda. So this Hutu Tutsi thing that led eventually to the massacre, it was through very kind of forced segregation of these two groups that historically would have mixed a lot more. That was the same in India as well, where it was a tool for separation. There's a majority Hindu, but there was a sizable minority of Muslim people as well, obviously, that were influenced by the Mughal Empire and when these great Islamic empires came to India as well. But that's when Muhammad Jinnah, he was concerned about the kind of rights of the Muslim minority in India, and he then started this Lahore resolution that started calling for Pakistan. And there's a really good episode just on him and even Gandhi and some of these key characters in the Empire podcast. And then so this is 1940, where the Muslim League was formed, calling for Pakistan. And then at this time, the kind of push for Indian independence was becoming, very significant across India. And in the World War II as well, the governor in India at that time, he declared war on behalf of India. And people in India were very upset because they're like, we didn't sign up to this war. And they didn't want to cooperate and die for a British Empire like they did in World War One with no rights given. And so they continued this quit India thing that the British then started to crack down. But because India were already pulled into the war, there were actually lots of people that joined, and the kind of impact around that time was there were over 2.5 million soldiers actually that took part in World War II. And also a bit of personal history, by the way. My great-grandfather, my great-grandfather, he fought for the British, and he was a pilot and died in World War One, and so he just didn't return. So there's some personal history also with kind of contributing to British war efforts, but that's a lot of soldiers, right? 2.5 million soldiers. And then in 1943 there was a Bengal famine where 3 million people died, and it was definitely due to mismanagement and Winston Churchill. And this is the biggest reason why I can't see him as the greatest Briton ever to have lived, like some popular polls say. Yes, granted, he was a very good wartime leader, but he basically did nothing to help this famine. And even though there was lots of grain in England, and some of his governors said, "Can you send this?" and he was like, "No, basically let those savages die." So 3 million people did die, but Britain will weaken after the war, of course. And so that's when a lot of their empire started to struggle and crumble, and lots of countries are pushing for independence, and there's it's just this global movement, and the pressure built. And then after World War II, the Labour Party came in, who were a bit more liberal when it came to colonialism. And then there was some more serious talks about partition and independence. So this was in 1947 at this stage, right? So far they've been successful pushing for independence. Britain said, yes, okay, we'll do it. So at that time, Lord Mountbatten, he was the governor in India. And so he wasn't the best manager, and he didn't handle this very well either. So the British knew that it was a ticking time bomb in India, and there'd be lots of violence when the British left and partition would happen, because they brought different voices to the party, Mountbatten, and he asked about a proposal for partition, because the Muslim League wanted partition because they were concerned about Muslim minority rights. And what he was proposing, no one could agree to. So he's like, well, the experts aren't agreeing, so I'll just go ahead and agree to it. So we are going to do partition. And by the way, we're going to bring it forward from June 1948 to August 1947. So that's what he did to kind of try and bring forward this independence. And he thought it was a masterstroke. He's like, how can we actually decide where to draw the lines of establishing a completely new country? And he's like, okay, let me bring this guy, Cyril Radcliffe, who's a civil servant from England, who's never been to India and knows nothing about India. Let's bring him to India for the first time, give him 10 weeks, and then let him try form the line. But this was really, it was an impossible job for Radcliffe, and he had lots of regret about it. I went to a partition museum also in Amritsar, which is really fascinating and sad and emotional also. But it was just like some of the decisions, like the kind of, we're talking about drawing lines to decide a new country to show where people will live. But some of the kind of I can't think of the word, the flippancy of making the decisions was kind of crazy. Like, for example, he kept Calcutta in the Indian side and gave Dhaka to the Bangladesh, or what was obviously East Pakistan side. So even though Lahore would have been more suited to be part of India due to its kind of makeup and religious and historical context, he was like, yeah, well, we gave you one city in the other side, so we have to give a city to Pakistan, like decisions like that were, and he was also ill, like with dysentery for a few weeks, and he got given people to help him, but he didn't know the context at all, so it was really impossible job. Very poor management from Mountbatten, and then they drew these lines, and then the British officially left 15th of August 1947 with great pomp, and Mountbatten intentionally didn't publish where the boundaries were drawn until a few days after the British left, because he knew that he'd messed up, or not that he knew he messed up, but he knew that there'd be havoc. And there were already, some quite serious violence in 1946, 1947, especially in Calcutta between the two religions, and lots of kind of fighting. So people were in this new country, there's this, a lovely speech from Nehru about at the dawn of midnight, there's this new country, India is free. But people realized they were minorities in a country that they didn't belong in. Then chaos, like complete chaos happened, and there was violence, pure hatred, and it was on like a crazy scale. So I think it's called the largest mass displacement of humans in all of human history. There was around 12 million people that were displaced across India-Pakistan borders, around 1 million people killed in riots, massacres, violence, like tens of thousands of women abducted, trafficked, and the museum does a really good job and very sobering job at just like stories of trains moving between countries and arriving like full of corpses, just completely killed. And there was just sometimes in human history you just see how capable humans are of such evil. And obviously with my Christian hat I call it sin, but yeah, it's just crazy. This is one of those stuff that um, it's almost like unimaginable, like ordinary people across all different religions. And this explains why there's so much beef and disagreement between India and Pakistan now, right? Because there's um, the way they were formed was so traumatic, and there's lots of deep rooted distrust and hurt from what happened on both sides. And it's not that long ago history. Like my own grandmother was alive during partition, and some of that generation have very strong feelings that it might come across as very anti-Muslim or anti-Hindu or anti-Pakistani or anti-Indian, but actually, yeah, it's because of this very sad thing in partition. And before it was all one country, and people were getting along. Before the British started to use religious divide and then the different countries. And even Jinnah, like he said, if he knew that he would be given a moth-eaten country, because he didn't imagine Pakistan would have so little land, he was like, I would never push for it. And I was thinking how illogical it is to have a country that's separated by India. You had Pakistan and then East Pakistan. And they were completely different language, completely different culture, different dress, different food, but they're the same religion, so we'll make them a country. And then in 1970, then East Pakistan had some beef and had a fight, then India got involved, and then Bangladesh was formed. And the reason why I spoke so much about partition is because those two states, West Bengal and Punjab, are the states where it was obviously divided, and that's where my family and ancestors are from. And actually, my father's Bengali heritage originally is in what is now Bangladesh, right? So actually, my family at that point were living in East Africa, and I was thinking, in an alternate world, if they didn't go to East Africa and they had to flee, then who knows what would have happened during the violence, and if they would have been killed, and there you go, I wouldn't have existed. So, yeah, it just shows how close his history is, and it's not that long ago. And yeah, afterwards, then there's a modern history of India, and if I give a summary of that, how I said 40% of India was under these princely states and Maharajas. They were given a choice: you either join India or join Pakistan. So obviously it didn't make logical sense for someone in South India to join Pakistan. And at this stage, people were migrating. The Muslims going to Pakistan, or what is now Bangladesh, the Hindus moving to India. And slowly the princely state started coming over to India, and then it made what is now unified India. And again, why this history is good to know is that in Kashmir, that prince sat on the fence and didn't make a decision. And so that's why even now, India and Pakistan both claim what is now Kashmir, because there wasn't a clear thing about, who actually owns it. And that's why, some of the recent fighting and attacks between India and Pakistan is over this disputed Kashmir, which links back to this part of history. So you can see how it really impacts things. And then each state, they kind of changed and moved, and what started off as a few states gradually fractionated, and most modern states now are separated largely in kind of cultural or language areas. So I think only like one or two states haven't changed. So most of the other ones have changed and have their own history. And yeah, now India is this unified thing that has all these billions of people, and is this modern India that we know. But like I said, each state has some amazing history. So I definitely advise or I recommend you to visit. And this was a bit longer than I was expecting because I got carried away talking and lots to talk about. But if I just end with some personal reflections, it was very special to be in India and to learn about the history and the beauty of India. And like I said, there's no one kind of Indian culture that's kind of, it's not monocultural, it's very vast. But, there are still, I guess, some commonalities. And it was so nice to see these different things. I think I went to about 12 different states of the 28 Indian states and came to appreciate India, this part of the world that my ancestors are from, which is really special. And to learn about the history, especially like partition history, which would have impacted both areas my family are from, and visiting as well the ancestral village where my grandparents are from. It just, I guess for me personally, India wasn't a place, it was like a story still being told, my own story. And I'm currently in the process of trying to get my overseas citizenship of India. That's how much I connected to India. I'd love to return. And even if I don't get that, I can get a tourist visa. And I guess many British people and even South Asians might not know a lot of this history. So I'd encourage you to look into it. Apparently, I am quite typical in the sense of the kind of third generation are wanting to look into it. So I also made a bit of a family tree by speaking to some relatives. And I think, my grandparents' generation obviously dealt with some of this trauma of partition and had no interest in talking about it because they'd spent time in India. Then their kids, who are now, in their 50s, 60s, 70s, they maybe weren't so interested either. But it's this third generation, us in our 20s and 30s that want to know about it, where we came from. We've never lived in India or in South Asia or Pakistan or Bangladesh. So if any of you actually have elderly relatives, then I'd encourage you to ask them about it, especially if you're from the diaspora or an ethnic minority, and even people in English background as well in England. Your parents or grandparents might have knowledge of what it was like, how they perceived India. Because these stories are really powerful, they can be painful, but I think they're worth remembering. And understanding this history, it helps us build empathy. It can help with healing and understanding our identity for those of us who are connected to this part of the world. And even if not, it's a history that's impacted a lot of geopolitical things now. So thank you for listening, and any questions, please let me know. But with that, thank you, friends, and goodbye.